Okay, we have quite a big panel. I think they don't get bigger than this. No, the theme was of interest, and so many wanted to intervene. So I will invite very short interventions. About 3-4 minutes, kind of a flash on the theme, and I will keep on the screen the theme that we're discussing. And so I'll probably start in the order in which we're seated, or maybe Michael, do you want to start? Okay, I guess that we could have a start. I think that Bart could be a good choice to frame this discussion, as it's been dealing more deeply on the overall picture of these issues. Bart?
Minutes do we each get?
Well, I would say about, oh yeah, here you go. So I would say 3 to 5 minutes, and then we have about an hour for the panel.
Thank you, Rufo, and good morning. So I just want to say a few things. I think Bruce gave a very good introduction to what we need. What we need is trust, and I think what we lack in Europe actually is trust. I think I'm actually quite surprised as an academic that after the Snowden revelations there was not more response from Europe. And of course Europe is never fast, we know that already. It takes always a long time. But also we don't seem to trust each other as nations. I mean, what we also saw in the Snowden documents, of course, is that nations are spying on each other. They've always been doing this, but now they're also hacking each other. But the European nations don't trust each other. And even very simple things are difficult. To give you one example, and I don't think, I'm a cryptographer, I come off cryptography, I don't think it's the most important thing, but it's a simple thing we need to agree on. And so, first observation is, some of the most important cryptographic standards were developed in Europe, but selected by NIST. And Europe had no voice there. In fact, great job from the Belgians, but in the end, the Americans decided which one would win. And several European nations have lists of recommended cryptographic algorithms. It's just simple advice to banks, insurance companies, hospitals, how many key bits you should use and which cipher you should use. It's just basic standard advice. It's all national. There is no European advice. So 11 years ago, in Network of Excellence, we decided to produce such a European document that would tell banks and governments and insurance companies and so on what the recommendations were. And every year we updated this. Our Network of Excellence stopped in 2013, and then ENISA took over this document and found some people to produce this document, which is widely used to actually give advice. You know what happened this year? Some nations asked ENISA to unpublish this document, to unpublish a document saying how many key bits you should use. And in fact, this document has been removed from their work program. The good news is I have a new eCrypt project, so I can produce, academics will produce a new list, but this is the basic stuff. We can't even in Europe allow academics to make basic recommendations on what you should use as crypto. So if you're in this level of distrust among nations, how can you build cyber-secure world? I find this very concerning. We have to first solve the trust issue. If we don't have basic trust, we're going to be attacking each other all the time, and we're going to be also attacked by all the other nations. I was very pleased because in my group we do software and hardware research, and we always keep saying it's not only software, it's not only hardware, you have to integrate it. And we also hear about open software, and you'll hear more about this later, but I didn't hear about open hardware. And in fact, free software, excuse me, maybe I made a big mistake, but at least. The question is, why don't we make also our hardware open? And in fact, you see that the big cloud companies, what they're doing, they switch for economic reasons to open hardware because they want to play their suppliers against each other. But there is no motivation for security or trust or a better society to actually insist on open hardware. I'm not saying everything should be made public or available, but at least some core components we should be able to also openly inspect. And the final point I want to make is the fact that you saw the quote by Bruce, in fact that the current era is funded by surveillance, advertising-driven business model, profiling-driven business model. So this is how money is being made. So if we want to change this, we have to weigh the economics. If If we're just gonna change technology, it's not gonna happen. We can make beautiful solutions, but if we don't change the business model, it's not gonna change anything. So I think we need new architectures, but those architectures will not happen unless we change regulation. And one very naive idea would be that, you know, you collect bytes of information. Most of us are being breached, large corporations are being breached regularly. What if, you know, you pay €1 per byte that's breached? Maybe companies would stop actually collecting all this information. Of course, it's maybe naive. I'm not a lawyer. It's very naive view of an academic. But I think if we don't start from the regulation, we will not be able to actually change technology. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, great. As far as order, I will follow the order as it's written on the paper. So the next in line is Richard. Richard, is you're next to talk and take on the challenge.
Okay, first I'll respond to a few points that have been made. One thing is I advocate free software, free as in freedom, logiciel libre, vrije software. The point is the user's freedom, the software should respect users' freedom. The users should be in the ones who control what the program does, not somebody else, the owner. And you can do this for hardware designs too. Hardware as such can't be libre in this sense, because once it's made as hardware, you can't change it, nobody can change it. But the hardware design is a work that can be edited and copied just like a program. So I think free hardware designs is a good thing. For more information, see gnu.org/philosophy/freehardwaredesigns.html. Now, since you mentioned a great hero, Edward Snowden, there's something that it's my duty to say. 3 cheers for Edward Snowden. Hip, hip, hooray. Hip, hip, hooray. Hip, hip, hooray. We need to say this because officials in the U.S. are still trying to demonize him. They call him a criminal when they, in fact, are the criminals. And they accuse him of violating his oath. He's the only one in that whole apparatus that kept his oath to defend the U.S. Constitution from all enemies, foreign or domestic. So we have to keep spreading the point that we admire him because he stood up for the people against dangerous government. Of course, we know that other governments snoop on people as well, and in fact, it's in the U.S. that there's been the most resistance to this. It's shameful the way a wave of governments around the world have legislated that they can snoop on anybody in any way at all, and there are no checks anymore. But that's what's happening. They figured that they would act first before the people got organized to say no. And, of course, corporations do work with the governments. It all adds up to spying. So I'd like to question the phrase constitutionally meaningful levels of trustworthiness. And the reason is when I judge what systems I can trust, it has almost nothing to do with the Constitution of the U.S. or whatever country it might be. That's not where the criteria for trustworthiness come from. They have something to do with what human rights we can legally claim. But, of course, even if a constitution doesn't defend your human rights, they're still your human rights. It's the Constitution that's at fault. But when we go away beyond further away from right and wrong and legality, and we go to trustworthiness, that has the judgment of that has almost nothing to do with any constitution. It's a question. It's a practical question, not just technical but social, of course. But still, it's a practical question that we can judge without reference to a constitution as standard.
Okay, thanks, Richard. Richard will have a full keynote after this panel. And next on is Andreas Wild. Please.
Thank you. I'm going to take something very risky now because I'm going to speak a little bit about trust in front of an eminent specialist that gave us a wonderful inspirational speech on it. Thank you. I want to highlight an aspect of trust that did not come in that very short, very brief description. Trust does not pre-exist and does not happen spontaneously. Trust is built up in a process normally. And some of the points that have been made here are basically showing that we are still at the beginning or in initial phases of building up trust, maybe in a new environment in which we are finding ourselves or in a new activity at a societal level and so forth. And therefore, there are not norms, this is a work in process. I'll give a brief example from my organization. We bring together member states, and we have at this point in time 24 member states participating, the European Commission and the private sector. It took about 3 years before we agreed among ourselves how to handle this extremely complicated beast in a halfway productive manner. It was not because we do now something differently. It took that long until everybody involved started trusting the others around the table and accepting that we go by similar norms and we don't harm each other, we don't attack the neighbors, and so forth and so forth. So it took some time together. Some of the talks or the points you made, for example, on European not being enough European. Europe is work in progress. Europe is the dream of USA federalist from the initial phases, a very, very, very weak federal construct with limited competencies and with limited resources. Remember that the whole European budget is about 130 billion. If that is we put in perspective, Germany has for its administration almost 10 times as much. France about 8 times as much. And so if you look at that, Europe as such will rank right before Denmark in terms of financial means. So Europe is a small federal institution that does not have all competencies. And the way Europeans grow together, I have to say it's my observation. I was with the private sector, with an American company all my career until about 6 years ago when I became a Brussels bureaucrat. But before I made that big jump, I realized that in fact, Europe can only evolve from crisis to crisis. And that is a fundamental mechanism, starts from the observation that the subsidiarity principle that is very strongly anchored in the institutions says that you will solve a problem at the lowest level possible, and you will move to the upper level only when you cannot find a solution. The only way to demonstrate that you cannot find a solution is you hit a snag. You have a crisis. That was the crisis of the euro that enabled them to transfer competencies from the national banking institutions to the European Federal Bank, and so forth. So it is the normal process. We can probably, if we get wiser, try to anticipate crises and try to do something to prevent, prolong, and move them ahead. This is not unnatural. And I believe what we are here to discuss today is, can we be wise enough to preempt the occurrence of a major crisis? Now, if you look at Snowden presentations and even things that happen now in conflicts around the world, and you see how cyber security and cyber attacks are used militarily and so on and so forth, the question is, do we have to wait until we are really under threat or really suffer, or can we anticipate and prevent something of that nature? I believe that maybe we become a little bit wiser and we can imagine along the lines, which I like very much indeed, and transparency, oversight and accountability are wonderful things to go by. Thank you very much.
Okay. So thanks for Andreas. And now we have Jovan Golic that possibly could tell us if it is possible. I mean, whatever the constitutional meaningful means, I mean, it's just setting an arbitrarily very high target that would be meaningful for a user. If this is doable, which most people don't think it's doable, and maybe how that could be.
Oh, well, thanks. Let me first start with some basic observation related to trust. It would appear that, in fact, to me, that trust has to do with the ability of humans to predict and then to have certain confidence that the things will go on as predicted. So this gives us comparative advantage to other species, but it relates to physical world. physical objects and systems. In cyberspace, we are dealing with bits. And then to have trust in the way that the bits are dealt with by humans is very difficult. And in fact, I would say it's unrealistic. Because, why? Because bits are easy to copy, first of all. So how can you trust that unless you protect the bit? This is why we need protection. This is why we need technology. So this is why in the action line we are pushing towards trustworthy technologies. And then, so we have solutions, we have algorithms, then lower down we have software platforms, we have hardware platforms. And in fact, in Europe, we have sufficient knowledge and expertise in all these areas. One of the problems is that Bart already mentioned, we are fragmented, and also other speakers before. We are fragmented. We have a great expertise in hardware security in countries like Germany, like France, and others, but in fact, and they all work on standardization, but the processes are very slow there. So we need to speed up the processes, to have dedication and real intentions to improve things. I believe that they can do much better in terms of certification, first of all, and then also in terms of standardization to improve the current situation, which is not good in terms of cybersecurity. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks to Jovan. Next online is Bjoern Rupp.
Thank you. Since it's supposed to be an introductory statement, I'll keep it brief. Is it possible to achieve meaningful IT assurance? Yes. Why do I say that? Because I'm an optimist, otherwise I wouldn't have founded a company. But in order to achieve that, we have to make a few hard choices. And that's often overlooked, even if all of us, even if everyone on this panel agrees on how these choices should be made. It doesn't mean that the rest of the population will necessarily agree or understand why these choices need to be made. And they involve things like higher cost for security, and they involve inconvenience. Obviously, if you want a super secure environment, then you somehow need to detach it from an unsecure general purpose computing environment that was developed without rules in mind that put security first. And just to round this off, just think of the aviation industry, which has an excellent record in maintaining high safety levels, but the cost that you pay for that is pretty high. First of all, innovation is only, well, incremental at best. And of course, the cost is considerable. So are we willing to trade, let's say, for instance, not getting the very latest features on a daily basis for a more stable, more well-founded, more robust and more secure system? These are the hard choices that we need to make, I believe.
Great. Thanks to Bjoern for this very lucid contribution. Next in line, Michael Sieber from European Defense Agency.
Okay, thank you. So from a defense point of view, I would say yes, we do want to have affordable, definitely, and user-friendly end-to-end IT services. But that's full stop. So for that, everything applies what I said, that first of all, we will not be able to fund the developments our own. We will have to rely on what is going on in the civil sector, in the industrial sector. And if it's not Europe, we have to rely on Chinese or on US American devices, as we partially, at least concerning NATO alliance, do already know. But as a European citizen, I would like to highlight maybe the frame of actors that we have in this whole game. It's first of all, as I mentioned, it's government and administration, it's industry, and it's the user, the end user itself. So when we talked about trust, I mean, constitutional meaningful level of user trustworthiness, if I lower it enough, then everybody will be happy. So the question is, are our levels possibly too high? If we look at users today, they probably be very low. And so I'll come back to the point I mentioned with responsibility. And I also quote Chancellor Merkel when she said, the internet is uncharted land. Now she's a physicist, so she probably has known about the internet for a long time, but for politicians it probably is uncharted land because there's a high level of uncertainty about the complexity, about many other things. So how should they take responsibility if they don't know the whole scope? So it will very much depend on the consultancy that they receive, on one hand from academia, but I guess as we've observed in the past, and I very much share the point with from crisis to crisis, and my goal would be to get ahead of the curve also in this domain. As we've observed in the past is that they like to react and react on pressure that they get. And the pressure usually comes out of economy and out of the market. And this is where we have to, as consultants that we all are because we tackle the problem, that we have to build up this pressure. And I believe as a citizen that this can come only through industry. And therefore there should be some ethics. Of course, the question in future will be, will the Volkswagen do the IT or will IT do, well, actually build the cars like Google is trying to? This is another revolutionary move that we have ahead of us. And the question then will be, where will we have to tackle the ethics actually of the big industry? But in a nutshell, I think politicians would be willing to do something in improving the trust building, improving conditions for trust and trustworthiness, but they need to have some pressure, some incentive, and also some good consultancy, and this comes from the other stakeholders. Thanks.
Thanks to Michael. Next online is Melle.
I believe so. Well, apparently Apple is now building cars as well, so and apparently like half of people will already buy them without even knowing what the car is going to be. Actually, the element that I wanted to focus on in what we were doing, what we were discussing here, is looking at user friendliness, because I think that's often one of the aspects that we're overlooking, and it's one of the aspects that I've been trying to look at a lot in the research that I've been doing. So mainly the fact that it's one of the aspects that usually get lost if we look at implementing more secure ways to make the software and things like that. So it means working more towards putting users in the driver's seat. So that requires, I think, some element of regulation in making the user central in in declaring what they want and what they want to reveal and what they keep in stock for themselves, and it requires a lot of effort as well on the part of industry in developing more ways to put this user in the driver's seat. So I think a lot of more effort needs to go into that, and I think it goes beyond just noticing here that we need to have more instruments in place. We need to think more about how we can actually make things work that are user friendly.
Thanks to Mel. Last in line for this first round is Pierre Chastanet.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I would like to build on what Mel just said on the fact that probably we're forgetting too much about one essential element in cybersecurity, that is the people, this is the user. I mean, we far too often look at cybersecurity as a technological challenge, as a technological problem, whereas mostly it's a societal challenge. In this respect, we have to look at how we can mainstream cybersecurity. Very often, we look at cybersecurity from, there is this famous triangle where you look at the technology, the processes, and the people. So a lot of emphasis is being put on technological development. Through a number of development, more and more emphasis is being put on processes, especially cybersecurity risk management. That's one of the thing we're trying to address through the NIS directive with critical operators in Europe that will have a mandate to put in place best practices in cybersecurity risk management for their operation. That's an essential element. But there is also this third element, which is the people. Usability of technological solution is absolutely essential. We have to look at mechanisms to try to mainstream the usage of cybersecurity and privacy solutions. We have to look at practical tools that the average citizen, that the average SME can implement in an easy manner to use in their everyday life. Most of the users are non-technological people, and we have to facilitate their usage of these technologies. ENISA, the European Network and Information Security Agency, produced a report recently about security incidents in the telecom sector. And they looked at a broad variety of incidents that occurred in this sector, and actually very few are actually coming from cyber attacks. Most of the incidents are occurring because of human errors. So is administrators that are wrongly configuring software, is people that are doing with administrator right, that are installing the wrong app or doing the wrong installation, that eventually lead to either vulnerabilities or systems getting down. So really a lot of emphasis need to be put on the people, again, across the value chain. So upstream, among the IT administrators, IT developers, software developers, there's a lot of emphasis to be put on the people that are designing and engineering these systems to make them eventually user-friendly and accessible for the ultimate use, and the whole ecosystem of people administrating this solution. The last point I wanted to make is one size doesn't fit all. I believe we can't address digital security and privacy requirement across the board in the same manner. We can't address citizens' need in the same way as we address the needs of critical infrastructure operations. So we need to develop specific solutions for the different communities with adequate level of security and privacy requirements. Thanks.
Okay, thanks to Pierre for this first round, and I think the interdisciplinarity of the panels is crucial, given the new framing that we've seen is needed for these kind of levels of security we're aiming at. I think Bart brought some great issue insofar as described the problem of trying to get documents, guidelines for high security that one nation was able to put pressure to have unpublished. And this puts the core of the problem not to the certification themselves, but to the organizational governance of the certifications. Because the only way we can hope to have right certifications, voluntary or mandatory, is having a certification body whose governance and election is accountable and technically proficient. At the European level, there's a consensus. Consensus means that one nation can intervene with maybe having interests allied with another nation, allied or none, that can take out security measures and guidelines which would achieve meaningful levels, because other nations, possibly not even European nations, don't want meaningful levels. So this governance problem probably cannot be solved by European Union, cannot be solved by a single nation, because each single nation has pressures from its internal public security. The other about international organizations like UN, it's very difficult because, of course, it's only indicatory and they have a problem in the decision-making process. So these kind of standards probably remains open, what the governance could be. Then we have Bruce now talking about many things, so spending days. But anyway, he talked, for example, about why he trusted an airline, and he talked about the airline itself. Now, there's processes which let me trust airline. But Bruce, you're not trusting airline, you're trusting FAA, which is the certification body, which is up on top of that airline, which makes so, since 1929, it was created, and made so that no airline could be on the air and keep a license unless it fit very stringent standards. And all the industry was behind it. Why? Because they knew that if planes kept falling down, the whole industry would go down. In fact, since it got established in 1929, over the next 5 years, numbers of passengers multiplied 15-fold after these kind of guidelines were done. And similar things were done in other sectors. And something like this probably needs to happen in IT security. But this time around, we can trust the US government or the industry itself to do it because there are conflicting interests. So you talked about the trust of Volkswagen and as far as the companies themselves actually hacking their own products. Well, you talked in certain speeches about Intel and about the fact that we have to assume processors to be compromised because they know some attackers have compromised everything and they can very well compromise that as well. And I would love to know if that compromise is scalable or not. Most people in the IT industry and community, they assume that those vulnerabilities are non-scalable. Those are not precious hacks that they keep only for some targeted users. But that's an assumption that I think it's very important to tackle. I'm going to try to quickly go through this. Melle talked about user friendliness, which is crucial because if you put a great device, and Bjoern knows about this as well, but then it doesn't have the kinks of the other devices, that's a problem. And I think that there could be some hope about the fact that our current phones are way too complicated and way too much bloatware. Now I have to do 10 actions to make a call when I used to be able to do it in one action. So there's a lot of bloatware that could give an advantage to very simplified systems right there. Then Pierre talking about user, people, and processes. Yeah, that's definitely a key issue going to the process, talking about human errors. Pierre talked about the need to have investment and investing on cybersecurity products. There's a DARPA analysis in which it looked at about 45% of critical vulnerabilities come from security software. So stacks of stuff that you put on top of completely broken things in the hopes of making it more safe. It's a recent news that authoritative analysis now analyze the Kaspersky antivirus actually adds your risk rather than reducing it. So it may not be a great investment buying all these products out there if they're just adding attack surface on something that was completely broken. So I'm just throwing some ideas, and so we should have time for another round, maybe a bit quicker than before. So we'll start again from Bart.
I think there is not much controversial being said, so it's kind of... So I agree with most people have being said. I still think that we have to change the architecture, and that should change things, because I think with the current architecture making things usable and trustworthy, and as it is now, the way we do things, we have to change the way we build systems, but also we have to rethink the architecture. So I think we should really try to make fundamental changes. I think incrementally changing what we have now, I don't think will bring us where we want to be. And I agree that the Snowden thing is a great crisis, but my concern is that what I see after Snowden is, in fact, rather than solving the problem, we're going to make it worse. And I see more nations saying, rather than we have to work together and solve this problem, the nations fall back to themselves. And in fact, Europe doesn't progress by crisis, but this crisis, Europe seems to go backwards. And this is my concern as an academic.
Okay, thanks, Bart. So next is Richard.
One thing that you mentioned the first time is the need to change the architecture of advertising-based websites. We have a project to do that. It's called GNU Taler. You can see it at taler.net. It's a digital payment system which mathematically provides anonymity and does not lend itself to tax evasion. It's not a currency like Bitcoin. It's a payment system. The system can determine how much payment each website receives, because the site can't just spend the money again by paying it on to someone else. It has to take that back to the mint and exchange it for money. So it solves, however, the problem of advertising-based websites by giving them another way to fund themselves. They say, pay for service. just or pay for this download the way you would go to a store in the past and pay cash anonymously for a CD or a book, something I still do, but something that has been impossible in the digital world. Either you have to pay and identify yourself, which I refuse to do, or you get tracked, which I won't let them do to me either. And I hope you won't allow it either, but with something like GNU Taller, we can have a system that respects our freedom.
Okay, so next we have, as before, Andreas.
Well, I kind of used the time for my both interventions the first time, but I will add just one or two ideas, however. Obviously, we speak on a topic that requires work. It's work in progress and has to be more effort added to it. On one side, financial effort. In the particular area I was talking about from my perspective of my organization, real investments maybe in capabilities, facilities, industries, and so forth to bring them up to the level at which trustworthiness can be approximately reached. And in the other areas, and absolutely obviously, in the effort of agreeing on norms. Agreeing on norms that then can be translated in standards, in oversight procedures, and so forth and so forth. On both fronts, I believe there's a stringent need of progress, and there be different communities engaged in those. I hope that on each front we will see both private initiatives and regulatory initiatives going forward. And this awareness in discussions like this contributes to that, obviously. Thank you.
Okay, very good. I just noticed that I jumped Bruce Schneier from the circle. So,
actually, I want to make two quick points. The first is that for most users, we use proxies as a mechanism of trust. I might decide what products to buy based on other people's expertise. So maybe I will look at the EFF, and because I trust them, and they're going to be my proxy. They will evaluate these products and tell me what to buy. The cell phone I have is an Apple one. For whatever reason, I decide on Apple, and they are effectively my proxy in the Apple store. And maybe that's good, maybe that's bad, but all users are going to do this. They're not going to evaluate things themselves. They lack the expertise. They're going to use proxies. We all do that all the time. So it's really important to make that proxy mechanism robust. Right? That I'm going to use just the licensing authority here in Brussels to choose my taxi. They're my proxy. I don't know how it works, but I'm going to trust that. And that gets very difficult in IT because there are lots of proxies everywhere. When we talk about the chain, it's the hardware manufacturer, the software manufacturer, the equipment manufacturer, whoever configures it, all down the line. And those are all effectively, whether I like it or not, my proxies for my interests, my security. And how that works is really important to pull out. I'll stop there.
okay. So we got next Jovan.
Thanks. I would just add one thing related to awareness of users. That's very important in the area of trust, especially in digital technologies, but also other technologies. In that sense, users should be aware of the problems and incidents. For example, Snowden revelations did a great thing to security business all over the world, and then the companies should try to improve their solutions and rebuild trust. So it is very important, this sort of, it's called also information sharing in the area. So sharing the information about incidents, but also sharing the information about best practices. So this is crucial thing for trust, and this is related to this proxy issue. So best practices are very important also in this digital world. And then also about the technologies. So what technologies are available for protecting the data? People do not know that. There are many technologies that are already practically available that can do amazing things, and they are not widely known, they are not widely used. just to tackle two things. Big data analytics, that's a big boost to data-driven economy. And it's very important also for business. And then, of course, all this can be done by respecting privacy. So by regulating anonymization, pseudonymization. There is no need to reveal data about particular users in order to compute statistical data to do predictions. So there is this privacy-aware data mining, all sorts of techniques. So I believe this should be regulated. Another thing, when you need, in fact, to profile users individually, is for targeted advertising. So this is very big thing, and these big players in cyberspace service providers, this is what they are doing. They are collecting all the time data, also illegitimately, so people are not aware of that. They're selling this data also. So all this targeted, this user profiling for targeted advertising can be done on the client side locally. So there is no need for them to do that and then sell among themselves and distribute. Everything can be done locally on a client, and they can be, in fact, this can be regulated. So all this profiling, that's a very critical thing, is user profiling and citizen profiling. It becomes citizen profiling when you associate identifiers to profiles that can be pseudonymous. And this is what they do. You can see that they tend to associate mobile numbers and this sort of things. So, I mean, there are many things that can be improved.
Okay, thanks, Jovan. Next online is Bjoern. And I would ask Bjoern, in respect to what he said before, he talked about high cost and inconvenience as a requirement that people don't understand as a need for accessing meaningful IT security. I would like to ask him if he sees a vulnerability problem on products like yours and in your class, in the operating system level and hardware level, where there may be vulnerabilities which may be accessible not only to high threat actors but even mid-level actors, and those critical vulnerabilities may actually be even scalably controlled one in there and stay there for years. We know that now some of the first cryptophones were created by Crypto AG, the Switzerland company, that for many, many years sold through all the governments, and then 10 years later it came out that very sophisticated backdoors were there for a few governments, and actually was partly owned and bought by the German government, so there were possibly many others coming in, and who knows who else. So what do you think is the current status, and how do we get where we should get?
Well, it's very hard to answer in a few minutes, but let me just give it a try. First of all, you're of course right. How much trust can you put in any complex system that wasn't designed from the start to be secure? So if you can't trust the components, then you have to verify all the components all the time. You have to monitor everything. If you can't trust the baseband chip, you have to monitor the baseband chip. If you don't trust the cryptographic algorithms, you have to be able to review them. They should be published in source code and so on and so on. So it goes on and on. Putting this in a wider context, I mean, a lot has been said. I'm just trying to distill it maybe in two points that I believe there's an implicit agreement here in the round. First of all, the IT security industry by itself cannot solve the problem. It has to be the wider IT industry as such. You can't put just something on top of a broken system. That's not enough. So that's maybe agreement number one. And number two is assuming we got that. Maybe certifications / standards / codification of best practices is a good way to do it. If these two assumptions hold, then how do we gain public awareness for that? How do we make sure that the general public buys in? Because as I said before, even if we all agree on that, that doesn't really help us much if we don't get public support for it. And that would also mean, I mean, just look at what it takes to license a chicken farm. Pretty substantial government licensing, procedures, process, and so on. However, you can start building, let me say something provocative, you can start a company that builds an operating system that is the foundation of major fraction of the world's IT, and you don't need a license for that, or at least not on the IT security level. So is that a good thing, that you don't need a license for that? It's not a simple question to answer. But these are the hard questions that we need to answer, and that's where we need to raise awareness and make sure that we can make an informed decision.
Thanks, Bjoern, for this answer. Basically, we don't not only need to have reach these actual levels of trustworthiness, but also need to have perceived trustworthiness, which matches, because you may have the right goods, but then it's not perceived as different than what is in the market. And possibly the two promises may be combined, because the certification body may have democratic accountability with direct citizen participation, which actually makes the quality of the certification process accessible by a normal citizens. And so this body can become the proxy that Bruce was mentioning. So instead of going on EFF website, or well, still go on Bruce's blog to get advice, because it's a great blog and it's a trusted source, but you could have a source with more resources and also more accountability directly. So next question to Michael. Recently, this was a high-level paper signed by world experts about forbidding autonomous weapons. So there are increasing technology of terrestrial and aerial systems which autonomously are set to some goals, and then autonomously go and set out to do their things, with huge risks not only for collateral damage, but risks of these devices flying from France and dropping a bomb on France. So, so you have self-damage as well. So this paper was very well received. A ton of scientists signed it. Someone has also mentioned the fact that even autonomous systems, terrestrial and aerial, which are not weaponized, are easily weaponized. If you have an autonomous vehicle which can be controlled, it can be easily, you can attach a weapon on it, or you can just drive it against something or somebody. So this issue is not only a problem. Recently we've seen news about hacks of single units of these devices. A car was hacked, and so on and so forth. What is the scalability of this? When we're going to have 1,000, 100 of these devices, how likely it is that an attacker could actually take hundreds of these devices and actually create huge damage? So what kind of trustworthiness levels we need to have for doing this, and how do we get there?
I don't want to be nasty, but should we defer this to the fourth panel when we'll be talking about this?
Well, yes.
Because I would like to make two remarks actually on,
Sure.
on to close.
Very well.
Maybe to close this one. For first, I would like to do a comparison with another area of our life that is similarly, I would say, emotional as it is with IT. It's mobility. And when we buy a car, usually 80% of the decision is with no brains at all. And then we use the 20% brains in order to justify the 80% that we have decided. So this is a typical user behavior. And I want to come back to the affordability of the solution. And what you mentioned with what this should not be, it should not, this event should not be favorizing a privileged group having very expensive but secure devices, etc. Now, if I look at car manufacturing, it has always been the premium segments, actually, that have introduced the safety features that everyone in the littlest smart car, today so smart as a brand, can take benefit of. So maybe this has to be the path, actually. And what also has been the case for a long time in car manufacturing is what they call target costing. So it's the tank lid of the Audi TT that makes the additional $5,000. So it's the enthusiastic criteria that the customer wants. So I think one thing of advertising, of marketing, and we have a wrong paradigm here, because we always, as user, claim software should be for free, or it should be cheap. And even governments tend to claim this, cut down on your IT costs, but they want security by the same token, right? So secure software cannot be cheap, because there's effort to it, right? So if we change this paradigm and say it's a privilege, it's an enthusiasm criterion to have secure software, and then maybe there is a path at the end to affordability. There may be no shortcut, but there may be a path at least to it. And second thing was on the work in progress, because I think we vastly agree on how this thing should look in the future. But the question is, what do we tackle first in order to get there and start working, and what kind of things do we have to do? Now coming back to EDA, we have a mechanism there which we call a category B product. So rather than getting a decision by all 28 or 27 in our case, because Denmark opted out, is that we form coalitions of willing, and we have a best practice mechanism how these can, in theory, get going very, very quickly with what they want. So it's typically 3 to 5 member states with a typical volume of 10 million, a bit similar, except that we don't have a third-party funding, but it's industrial co-funding in there, and it's governmental funding. And we do this in coordination, by the way, in the European Framework Cooperation with the Commission, with other agencies, Space Agency, as you mentioned in the beginning. So these were my 2 points. And the other one, I'm happy to come back to that in the fourth panel on the autonomous.
So I would like to end up the panel with a last question to Bruce, which I hinted at before. I think he understood very well. Is that we talked about vulnerabilities at the CPU level or fabrication level or whatever, vulnerabilities at critical levels now, which are usually not worked on by the community. And the community, even after some declarations by Snowden and other things, that documents from NSA saying that they keep certain exploits only for certain targeted people, because if you use a malware, then it could be discovered, and next time you can't use it. So there is a way of not abusing that. But these declarations have been used to assume that extensive attacks on the layers beyond encryption, on the endpoint of all systems, highest assurance system and so on, are non-scalable or not easily scalable by users. On the other side, we see descriptions of systems like NSA Turbine and the hacking team, which actually employ artificial intelligence to understand what's the user and use the best means, the easiest mean to get into towards them. There's also a bunch of techniques in which the malware I put in could be encrypted and obfuscated so that it can cancel itself, self-kill, so avoid spoiling it. So this is a crucial issue, because if it's the case that those are scalable, like actually I assume, and many I assume, then much of the work that is being done on so-called end-to-end encryption may be missing the point. Yeah.
So very generally, whenever you ask a question about the NSA saying A or B, the answer is always both. The NSA will robustly try to break systems. The question is really dependent on what your definition of scalable is, and it's scalable versus risk. So there are low-risk attacks that are very scalable, which is like sitting in the backbone and grabbing everything. That is easily scalable at very little risk. There are attacks that involve going after the endpoints that require specialized malware, and they are much higher risk. So sort of by extension, they're less scalable because the NSA wants to keep them for only high-value targets. There's lots of stuff in the middle. What do you count the hacking at the SIM company and grabbing all the SIM keys, right? That's not a scalable attack, but the result was very scalable. So you tend to see all sorts of things going into at a chip level and making some change. We believe that the Chinese do this. The NSA probably would if they could, which means they will or are, is something that is not scalable in execution, but the result is extraordinarily scalable. So I think that we have to assume that there exists scalable attacks at all levels. All attacks are not scalable at the level of risk the NSA wants to assume, or other country. I mean, search your country here. But there are going to be scalable attacks. An example is we know that Microsoft feeds the NSA advance warning of patches they are going to put out in the next few weeks. At that point, what you have is a targeted attack using that vulnerability that is extraordinarily scalable because you've only got a few weeks, and then it goes away. There's very little risk you'll give someone else information they can use against you. So a targeted thing becomes scalable because it's going to be fixed very soon. So don't think that non-scalability will save you. There are lots of attacks that aren't scalable because of risk, but it's not going to be all of them.
Okay, very well. Let me just, on the scalability, it's very important, like trying to get a shared idea. So of course, when you can tap a fiber, a transatlantic fiber, you can get all the communication, everything of hundreds of millions of people. But arguably, it's not the scalability. Scalability of attacks doesn't necessarily need to intercept tens or hundreds of millions of people, because 99% of people don't matter. So don't matter for their power. Don't matter to. So if they can do scalably and do tens or hundreds of thousands of people, which are important people and all their relatives and people close to them, you got all the power you need. So, and that are...
But the NSA's argument is we don't know who they are beforehand. I'll make their case for them.
Okay.
What they will say is we need to get everybody because we don't know who we need to get until after we've gotten everybody.
Sure.
That's the fundamental argument for bulk surveillance.
Sure.
We don't know who beforehand.
Sure, that's everything. But talking about targeted, once they know who they want to target, then reading the documents from NSA Turbine and hacking team, they can manage over 100,000 to millions of devices which have been hacked. They can use Fox Acid to automate the hacking, so they automatically uses the best thing, and then they use this other system to manage this group of zombies, so-called, to actually do this kind of things. So this, to me, equates to scalability, which is not as much as passive surveillance, but it's extremely scalable. So this, I think, would possibly be a crucial issue to convince that we really need to go at the end point, beyond the encryption, and actually solve that issue. Even Jacob Appelbaum in a view actually said that targeted surveillance is not really, it's just a different mean, is as massive as passive surveillance. It's just a different way, and actually they work together. So that's something that I think it's also a good authoritative opinion. So if someone has some last words to close this panel, I think we can go back on track. Okay, so I thank everybody for this panel, and we can move on to the next keynote.